In a tranquil old town, the disappearance of 7-year-old Ethan turned every resident's life upside down. Daniel, his father, became a fixture on local news, leading search efforts with a determination that bordered on obsession, promising he would never stop until Ethan was found. 4 years later, with the mystery unsolved, Daniel uttered a statement that left everyone stunned. "I had to do it." Daniel stood on the creaky porch of his old farmhouse, staring out into the vast, untamed woods that bordered the town. Heavy with the weight of sleepless nights, he scanned the horizon as if he could will his son Ethan to appear by sheer force of will. Town life had long since resumed as normal, but for Daniel, time had stopped 4 years ago. At the local diner, whispers circulated. The news of Daniel's recent statement had spread like wildfire. "I had to do it," he had said in haste. But what did that mean? The townspeople speculated over their breakfast, trading theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Each person glanced over at Daniel, who sat alone at his usual corner table, his breakfast untouched. Sarah, the diner's owner, and Daniel's longtime friend approached his table with slight hesitation. "Danny, you gotta eat something," she murmured, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up, his gaze hollow. "They don't understand, Sarah. They don't know what it's been like." Her heart ached for him, but fear gnawed at her gut. What had Daniel done? Later that day, Daniel received a visit from Detective Simmons, a big man with sharp eyes. "Daniel, we need to talk about what you said the other day," he began, his voice steady yet carrying the unmistakable edge of urgency. Daniel led him into his living room, the walls lined with pictures of Ethan. "I know what it sounds like, Detective, but it's not what you think," Daniel said, sinking into a chair with a sigh. As Simmons took notes, Daniel recounted the days leading up to Ethan's disappearance again, his voice breaking as he described their last morning together. Pancakes for breakfast, Ethan's laughter filling the house. "It was a perfect day until it wasn't," Daniel choked out. Simmons listened intently, his expression unreadable. Halfway into their conversation, Daniel's sister Melissa arrived unexpectedly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. "I heard what you said in the diner," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel stiffened, the air between them charged with a sudden, tense energy. "Mel, he started, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Not here," she said, glancing nervously at the detective. Melissa insisted they take a walk, leading Daniel away from the prying eyes of the town and the curiosity of Detective Simmons. As they walked through the desolate park where Ethan used to play, Melissa finally spoke. "Danny, what did you mean by 'I had to do it'? Are you in trouble?" Daniel's face was a mask of sorrow. "It's complicated, Mel. It's about Ethan and about us." At the station, Simmons reviewed the old case files on Ethan's disappearance. There were inconsistencies in the testimonies and gaps in the timeline that never quite made sense. Simmons had always suspected that someone close to the case was withholding information. As he revisited the details, a forgotten statement from a neighbor caught his eye, a clue that had been overlooked. That evening, Daniel stood in Ethan's room, untouched since that fateful day. The small bed, the model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, the posters of space adventures on the walls, it all hurt to look at. Daniel ran his fingers over the dusty surfaces. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of resolve reignited by his sister's words. He'd bring his son home. The following morning, Daniel decided it was time to confront the past. He called Detective Simmons, his voice more determined than it had been in years. "Detective, we need to meet." There's something I haven't told you, something I've been too afraid to say." Simmons, sensing the gravity in Daniel's tone, agreed immediately. As he prepared to leave, he wondered what secrets Daniel had kept from him for the past 4 years. At the diner, Daniel and Detective Simmons walked in together, drawing immediate stares. The whispers started almost instantly, a low hum of curiosity and suspicion. "Morning, Daniel," Simmons said, trying to cut through the tension. "Morning," Daniel replied, his voice flat. The clatter of cutlery and murmur of voices felt oppressive, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Simmons glanced around, sensing the growing discomfort in Daniel's posture. "Let's step outside," Simmons suggested, noticing Daniel's unease. "Too many eyes in here." Daniel nodded, relief evident on his face. They turned and walked out, the bell above the door jingling sharply. The morning sun felt like a release from the diner's stifling atmosphere, making the tension melt away just a bit. "Better out here," Daniel muttered. "Yeah," Simmons agreed, leading the way. Outside, they walked down the main street. Daniel's steps were slow at first, his eyes darting around. "You okay?" Simmons asked. "Yeah, it's been a while since I felt this exposed," Daniel admitted. The shops and passers-by provided a busy backdrop, but it was less suffocating than the diner. Daniel started to relax a bit. "We'll find a quiet spot," Simmons assured him, glancing at the townspeople. People tried to eavesdrop, stretching their necks from behind window panes, but Simmons kept their pace brisk, pulling further away from the prying eyes. The murmurs of the crowd faded into a backdrop of footsteps on pavement and the distant calls of morning vendors. "Feels like everyone's watching," Daniel muttered. "They are," Simmons replied. "Let's keep moving." Daniel quickened his pace, matching Simmons's stride as they distanced themselves from the curious eyes. The diner's noise dimmed as they neared the woods. The trees stood tall, their leaves whispering secrets. "Almost there," Simmons said, glancing back at the distant town. "Good," Daniel replied. "Too many memories back there." The forest loomed ahead, offering a sense of seclusion and peace that the town couldn't provide. "Ready?" Simmons asked. "Yeah, let's go," Daniel nodded. The forest's edge felt like a boundary between their troubled past and a place to find some answers. Daniel and Detective Simmons ventured towards the forest entrance, leaves crunching underfoot as they walked into the trees. The morning light filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Daniel felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He knew this conversation was long overdue. Simmons stayed silent, his presence steady and reassuring, as they made their way deeper into the woods, away from the town's watchful eyes. Simmons waited quietly, giving Daniel the space to speak. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Daniel stalled, nervously fidgeting with his jacket. He took a deep breath, his fingers tugging at the zipper. Simmons didn't push, knowing that forcing the conversation wouldn't help. He just kept walking, letting Daniel find his words in his own time. After a long pause, Daniel finally looked Simmons in the eye. "It's my fault," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Simmons stopped, turning to face him fully. Daniel's shoulders slumped as the weight of his confession settled between them. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Daniel to continue. Simmons stayed silent, giving him the space he needed. Simmons listened carefully, waiting for more details. Daniel hesitated, his eyes scanning the forest floor as if searching for the right words. "I should have seen the signs," Daniel murmured, his voice filled with regret. The detective nodded, encouraging him without saying a word. The trees around them stood tall and silent, a quiet audience to Daniel's slow, painful revelation. He sighed deeply and repeated, "It's my fault," his voice low and filled with guilt. Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The forest seemed to echo his words, amplifying the weight of his confession. Simmons leaned in slightly, his expression serious but compassionate. "Go on," he urged gently. Daniel took another shaky breath, bracing himself to reveal the truth he'd been hiding. Simmons leaned closer to Daniel, asking, "What do you mean?" prompting Daniel to reveal a grim family history. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes searching Simmons's face for understanding. "It's not just about Ethan. It's about our family and what we've become." Simmons nodded, encouraging him to continue. Daniel's voice trembled as he began to unravel the dark secrets that had haunted him for years. He spoke of a ruthless business rivalry, passed down through generations, pitting him against his sister, Melissa. "Our parents fueled the competition," Daniel explained. "It was always about who would take over the family business. They played us against each other, and it got worse with time." Simmons listened, his face reflecting the gravity of Daniel's words. The weight of the past seemed to hang heavy in the air. Daniel shared childhood stories of sibling competition, recounting the endless ways he and Melissa clashed. "We competed in everything," he said, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "School, sports, even friends. It was never enough to just be good. We had to be better than the other." Simmons nodded, understanding the roots of their rivalry. Daniel's voice softened as he spoke of the long, bitter feud that had shaped their lives. The intense desire to prove themselves created a toxic rivalry between the two of them. "It wasn't just sibling rivalry," Daniel said. "It was toxic. We were constantly at each other's throats, trying to one-up each other." He sighed, the memories clearly painful. "It turned us into enemies, not just siblings." Simmons absorbed every word, piecing together the puzzle of Daniel's troubled past and the impact it had on his present. Simmons listened intently as Daniel revealed the bitter lengths his family went to secure power. "Our parents would do anything to come out on top," Daniel said, his voice filled with regret. "And they taught us to do the same. It became about more than business. It was personal. The stakes were always high." Simmons could see the pain in Daniel's eyes, the toll this lifelong struggle had taken on him. Detective Simmons let Daniel continue speaking, walking alongside him as they pushed deeper into the forest. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds filled the silence between them. "There's more you need to know," Daniel began, his voice low. Simmons nodded, waiting patiently. The trees closed in around them, creating a sense of isolation, perfect for the secrets Daniel was about to reveal. Daniel spoke of Mark, a brother Simmons hadn't heard of before, only to clarify that he was no longer alive. "Mark was the eldest," Daniel said, his voice tinged with sadness. Simmons raised an eyebrow, surprised by this new information. "He was supposed to take over the business," Daniel continued, "but things didn't go as planned." Simmons sensed there was a lot more to this story. Simmons was stunned and questioned Daniel about Mark's absence, confused about why he hadn't been mentioned. "Why haven't you ever talked about Mark?" Simmons asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he replied. "Mark's story isn't something we talked about. It was too painful, and our parents made sure we didn't." Simmons waited for him to elaborate. Daniel paused, then spoke ominously. "I had a brother. He's no longer with us," his tone heavy with emotion. The words hung in the air, thick with grief. Simmons looked at Daniel, seeing the pain etched on his face. "What happened to him?" Simmons asked softly. Daniel's eyes met his, filled with a deep sorrow. "It's a long story, one I've avoided for too long," Daniel admitted. Daniel recounted how their father removed Mark from their ruthless competition, never to be seen again. "Dad said Mark wasn't cut out for it," Daniel explained, his voice breaking. "One day he was just gone. No warning, no explanation. Just gone." Simmons listened intently, piecing together the dark family history. "We were told not to ask questions," Daniel added, his face a mix of anger and sadness. Detective Simmons probed further, asking Daniel for specifics on what happened to Mark years ago. "What exactly happened that day?" Simmons asked, his voice steady. Daniel hesitated, his gaze drifting to the forest around them. "It was a long time ago," he began. "Mark was always different, always better. That's what made it hard." Simmons leaned in, knowing there was more to this story that Daniel needed to share. Daniel described the ruthless sibling rivalry and how Mark always seemed to outshine him and Melissa. "Mark was the golden child," Daniel said bitterly. "He excelled at everything, school, sports, even the business. Dad saw him as the future." Simmons listened, noting the mix of admiration and resentment in Daniel's voice. "Melissa and I were always trying to catch up, but we never could," Daniel continued, shaking his head. "Their father, frustrated with Mark's dominance, took him deep into the forest one day and returned alone. It was supposed to be a hunting trip," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad and Mark went into the woods, but only Dad came back." Simmons felt a chill run down his spine. "He said Mark got lost, that he'd find his way back. But he never did," Daniel added, his eyes dark with memory. Simmons listened in disbelief as Daniel revealed how their father orchestrated this, claiming Mark never came back. "Dad kept saying it was an accident," Daniel explained, "but I knew he had a hand in it. He was too calm, too prepared with answers." Simmons's mind raced as he tried to comprehend the depth of the family's secrets. "It was like he had planned for Mark to disappear," Daniel said, his voice filled with pain. Simmons pressed for more, but Daniel insisted their father took the secret to the grave. "We tried to get answers, Melissa and I," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "But Dad never budged. He took whatever he knew with him when he died." Simmons could see the anguish in Daniel's eyes, the unresolved grief that still haunted him. "We never found out what really happened to Mark," Daniel concluded, his tone heavy with regret. Alarm washed over Simmons as Daniel nodded solemnly, revealing the suspicion about Mark's fate. "So, you think your father did something to Mark?" Simmons asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniel nodded again, his eyes reflecting years of uncertainty. "I don't just think it. I'm almost sure of it. But I can't prove it. No one can," he said quietly. Simmons felt a shiver run through him as the reality of Daniel's words sank in. Simmons asked what happened after, and Daniel explained their father's expectation for him and Melissa to compete. After Mark disappeared, Dad made it clear that the family business was at stake, Daniel said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "He pitted us against each other, told us only one of us could take over. It was his way of making sure we stayed hungry, always fighting for his approval," Daniel added, shaking his head. With Mark gone, Daniel and Melissa were forced to battle for control of the family business. "It was brutal," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day was a new challenge, a new way to prove we were worthy. Melissa and I became enemies, fighting for something we didn't even want." Simmons could see the pain in Daniel's eyes, the scars left by years of relentless competition. They tried to resist, but their father's influence pushed them into a relentless competition. We didn't want to fight each other, Daniel explained, but Dad had a way of making us feel like we had no choice. He'd dangle the business in front of us, then pull it away, just to see how far we'd go. Simmons felt a deep sense of pity for Daniel and Melissa, trapped in their father's manipulative games. Daniel shook his head at the memory, remorsefully reflecting on how they were manipulated for control. "We lost so much," he said, his voice filled with regret. "Our childhood, our bond as siblings. Everything became about winning, about proving ourselves to a man who never really cared." Simmons nodded, understanding the heavy burden Daniel carried. "It's hard to let go of the past when it's shaped so much of who you are," Simmons said quietly. They reached a forest clearing, settling on a log to discuss Daniel's past more openly. Simmons sat down beside him, the forest quieting around them. "So, what happened next?" Simmons asked, his voice gentle. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the trees. "Melissa and we made a pact," he began. "We swore we'd never let our father's legacy control us or our future families." Daniel explained how he and Melissa vowed to break free from their father's ruthless legacy. "We were determined," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "We promised each other that we wouldn't let our kids go through what we did. We wanted to end the cycle, to be better than him." Simmons nodded, feeling the weight of Daniel's words. "It must have been tough, living under that shadow," he said. They had promised not to continue the vicious tradition if they had children of their own. "We knew it would be hard," Daniel continued, "but we believed in each other. We thought we could change things." He looked down at his hands, the memories clearly painful. "Melissa was stronger than me," he admitted. "She always believed we could escape, even when things seemed impossible." Daniel buried his face in his hands, admitting, "But I think I failed, Simmons." Simmons leaned in, his brow furrowed with concern. "Why do you say that?" he asked gently. Daniel's voice was muffled by his hands. "Because I couldn't stop it. The same patterns, the same mistakes. I see them happening again," he said, his shoulders shaking. Simmons placed a comforting hand on Daniel's back. Simmons listened, understanding the weight Daniel had carried, and encouraged him to keep speaking. "It's okay, Daniel," he said softly. "You're doing your best. Just keep talking to me." Daniel lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed but more determined. "Thanks, Simmons," he said quietly. "It's just hard to face it all. But I know I have to, for my kids' sake, for Melissa's memory." Simmons nodded, feeling a deep respect for Daniel's struggle. Detective Simmons processed Daniel's story, recognizing a pattern of mysterious disappearances in Daniel's family. As Daniel talked, Simmons started piecing things together. "Wait," Simmons said, holding up a hand. "You're telling me Mark just vanished? And now Ethan's gone?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like a curse," he said, voice shaking. Simmons felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were starting to fit. He realized there were multiple deaths and absences that no one had connected before. Simmons frowned, his mind racing. "So, Mark disappeared," he muttered, thinking out loud. "And then, your father died under strange circumstances. Now, Ethan." Daniel looked at him, eyes wide. "You think it's all connected?" Simmons nodded, more certain with each passing second. "I do," he said. "It's too much to be a coincidence." Every clue seemed to fall into place, making the strange family legacy clear to Simmons. He thought back to all the stories he'd heard about the family's ruthless ways. "This isn't just bad luck," Simmons said, meeting Daniel's gaze. "It's a pattern." Daniel swallowed hard, So, what do we do? Simmons stood up, determination in his eyes. We find Ethan, and we break this cycle once and for all. Simmons told Daniel, I think I know where Ethan is, before setting his jaw with determination. Daniel looked up, hope and fear mingling in his expression. You do? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Simmons nodded. If we follow the clues, they lead us deeper into the forest. That's where we'll find him. Daniel stood, his legs shaky but resolute. All right, he said. Let's go. Daniel, worn down by guilt, nodded and agreed to follow Simmons deeper into the forest. I trust you, Daniel said, his voice raw. Simmons gave him a reassuring nod. We'll find him, Daniel, he promised. They began to walk, the forest growing denser around them. Daniel glanced back at the path they'd come from, then forward with determination. Lead the way, Simmons, he said, his voice steady. Together, Daniel and Detective Simmons hiked further into the forest, foliage thickening around them. The air grew cooler, and the light dimmed as the canopy overhead blocked out the sun. Stay close, Simmons said, glancing back at Daniel. This place can be tricky. Daniel nodded, stepping over a fallen branch. The forest felt alive, whispering secrets they were desperate to uncover. Every step brought them closer to the truth. Simmons called for backup, while Daniel phoned Melissa to tell her he'd shared their secret. Melissa, I had to tell Simmons everything, Daniel said, his voice shaky. There was a long pause on the other end. Did you mention Dad? Melissa asked. Yes, Daniel replied. And Mark. Melissa sighed heavily. Just be careful, Daniel, she urged. We have to find Ethan, but don't trust anyone completely. Simmons listened, alert. Melissa anxiously urged caution, but understood the urgency of finding Ethan. I get it, Daniel. Ethan's life is on the line, she said. But this family, our history, it's dangerous. Daniel could hear the fear in her voice. I know, Melissa, he said softly. We'll be careful. But we can't just leave Ethan out there. Melissa sighed again. Just promise me you'll watch your back, she insisted. I promise, Daniel replied. The trees grew denser as they journeyed toward their destination, Simmons leading the way. We're getting close, Simmons said, pushing aside a low-hanging branch. Daniel followed, his heart pounding. The forest seemed to close in around them, each step more challenging than the last. How do you know? Daniel asked. Simmons paused, looking back. It's a hunch, he admitted, but everything points to this area. Daniel took a deep breath, nodding. Simmons warned Daniel not to get his hopes up, knowing Ethan had been missing for 4 years. Listen, Simmons said, stopping to face Daniel. I know you want to find Ethan, but he's been gone a long time. We might not like what we find. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes serious. I understand, he said, but I have to know, one way or another. Simmons nodded, appreciating Daniel's resolve. Let's keep moving, he said. In the forest's heart, Simmons stopped Daniel with an arm, pointing out possible traps ahead. Watch your step, Simmons whispered, eyes scanning the ground. Daniel froze, following Simmons's gaze to see hidden snares and tripwires. They don't want anyone finding this place, Simmons muttered. Daniel nodded, carefully placing his feet to avoid the traps. The air grew tense, every sound amplified in the eerie silence of the deep forest. Simmons described an isolated community that didn't abide by usual societal norms. These people live off the grid, he explained quietly. They have their own rules, their own way of life. Outsiders aren't welcome. Daniel's eyes widened. Do you think Ethan is with them? He asked. Simmons nodded. It's possible. They're known for taking in strays, but they're also very secretive. Daniel shivered, the weight of their mission sinking in. Daniel looked around warily, aware they were being watched from the shadows. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Simmons nodded slightly, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "Stay calm," Simmons advised. "They won't reveal themselves unless we make a move." Daniel's heart raced, the forest feeling more oppressive with each passing second. He could sense eyes on him, tracking their every movement. They were close to something. Or someone. A human call pierced the air, signaling their presence had been noticed. Daniel and Simmons halted, exchanging tense glances. "What was that?" Daniel asked, voice shaking. "A warning," Simmons replied grimly. "They know we're here." The call echoed again, sending chills down Daniel's spine. He gripped his phone tightly, ready to call Melissa if needed. The forest seemed to close in around them, the air thick with anticipation. They stood firm, ready for confrontation as leaves rustled, hinting at someone approaching them. Simmons signaled for Daniel to stay behind him, drawing his weapon. "Who's there?" Simmons called out, voice steady. The rustling grew louder, and a figure began to take shape among the trees. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, heart pounding. They braced themselves, not knowing what or who would emerge from the shadows. A woman Daniel's age emerged from the trees, scrutinizing them and demanding their business. "Who are you, and what do you want?" she asked, her eyes narrowed. Simmons stepped forward, showing his badge. "Detective Simmons, this is Daniel. We're looking for his son, Ethan." The woman's expression softened slightly, but remained guarded. "This isn't a place for outsiders," she warned, glancing around as if expecting trouble. Daniel explained they were searching for his missing son, Ethan, as she studied his face. "He disappeared 4 years ago," Daniel said, voice cracking. The woman's gaze softened. "We don't get many visitors here," she said, "but we do protect the lost." She took a step closer, looking directly into Daniel's eyes. "Show me a picture of Ethan," she instructed. Daniel quickly pulled out his phone, displaying a photo of his son. With a nod, she guided them through the woods to a hidden camp where children played. "Stay close and don't speak to anyone," she advised. The camp was nestled deep within the forest, concealed by thick foliage. Children of various ages ran around, laughing and playing. Daniel's heart pounded as they walked through the camp, eyes scanning for any sign of Ethan. "This way," the woman said, leading them to a small clearing. Ethan hesitated at first, but recognized Daniel and ran to him, embracing him tightly. "Dad!" Ethan cried out, his voice filled with emotion. Daniel dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around his son. "Ethan, thank God," Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face. Simmons watched, a relieved smile on his face. The camp fell silent as everyone took in the reunion. Daniel held Ethan close, unwilling to let go. He confessed he'd run away after overhearing a family conversation, only to be taken in by the camp. "I heard you and Aunt Melissa talking about the business," Ethan said, looking down. "I was scared, so I ran." Daniel nodded, understanding. "You did the right thing, Ethan. I'm so sorry you felt you had to leave," he said, holding his son's hand. The woman who had led them there smiled softly. "You're safe now," she assured them,